The boomers were the idealistic blind liberals, and now this is very important for us. If you're trying a case against corporations, which we often do, the boomers were skeptical about corporate America. They were skeptical about the influence of corporate America, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us of. And we could stand up in front of a boomer jury, and we did many occasions, and begin a forward hour by saying this is just another typical case in which a greedy corporation has placed profits ahead of the safety of the American public. You're going to get a bad result if you try to do that today. You wouldn't get the right response that you want if you try to do it to this conservative Generation X group. Number one, because they've been just fed tort reform for their entire lives. But number two, they reject just the straight up anti-corporate mentality. They don't buy into it at all. So you can prove that this corporation is bad and what this corporation did on this occasion is bad. You don't have to take on any more burden of proof, and don't take on any more burden of proof than you have to have. We don't have to prove that the entire corporate world is just greedy and designing bad products for their own profit. We don't have to prove that this corporation is doing that across the board in everything we do. All we have to prove is that this corporation on this occasion on this product, in this particular design of this particular part, this defective part, in this occasion, they made a mistake, they covered it up, whatever your evidence is, and as a result of that, they injured our client. So don't take on any greater burden of proof than you have to carry, and you take that on when you start talking hyperbolically about anti-corporate America themes, and right off the bat, you're going to raise the skepticism of these juries. So those days are gone. These folks were the perfect target for tort reformers, as I've said many times, because they ended up with this anti-corporate mentality, or they rejected the anti-corporate mentality. How do you communicate with them? They're raised as tort reformers. They were raised with personal responsibility as their own theme, so it's the theme that they resonate to. So as I've said, adopt this. Be sure you get personal responsibility as the plaintiff's theme going in. They are the generation that were first taught about how everything we file is a frivolous lawsuit, and how the frivolous lawsuits are clogging the courts, and how you can't get a real case to trial because the frivolous lawsuits are clogging the courts in front of the legitimate cases. And the reason it takes 3 to 4 years to get a case to trial is because of frivolous lawsuits. One of the things I've done successfully with Gen X on this frivolous lawsuit issue is I say, okay, you've heard about frivolous lawsuits, but sir, you pick one out. Sir, you talk about frivolous lawsuits, but let me ask you this. How do you feel about frivolous defenses? Suppose you had a defense in a case, and you take one where they've just had one of those pleadings that sets out every possible defense they can think of, and I've taken this out of it. I say, I'm looking at the pleading that they filed in this case. They've said at the defense that this was an act of God. Now, sir, are you willing to listen along carefully to the evidence in this case and listen carefully to see if there's an act of God involved here? And if there's not, how would you feel about that as a frivolous defense? And that's gotten some really good, it gets some good results on voir dire examination, but it gets a good discussion started too. So you shift the discussion. Frivolous malpractice cases. They seriously believe, the medical society has done a great job in making them believe that all malpractice cases are frivolous. They've ended up with tort reform all over the country, and especially in Texas, that just protects medical malpractice. It protects the practitioners of medical malpractice. And the result is that medical errors are now one of the greatest causes of death in this country. And the numbers are increasing exponentially. But they've been successful with it. And they've been successful with it. And remember this, it was this generation they sold it to. So think about that when you're looking at Gen X jurors. They think greedy trial lawyers is one word. They've been hearing this their entire life. They were raised with greedy trial lawyers. So what you can do about that is make very certain that you're not playing into their preconceived notion of what a greedy trial lawyer is. So when you stand up, you've got a couple of strikes against you, and if you want to get that third strike very quickly, then stand up on voir dire and start using the rhetoric that they would expect from a greedy trial lawyer. Start using hyperbole. Start making a lot of promises that you know you can't possibly keep. Start making attacks on the defendant that you know you can't possibly prove. Go ahead and just play right into that, and then see the consequences of it. It's just stupid. They have Gen X has a conservative skepticism. They're skeptical of us, but more importantly, they also reject the boomer rhetoric regarding, when we had the boomers on the stand, they always cheer for the underdog. That was a characteristic of their generation. They'd pull for the underdog, which is great for us because generally we represent the underdog. Generation X doesn't buy into the rhetoric regarding cheering for the underdog. That's important to us. They don't buy into the rhetoric regarding evil corporate America, because evil corporate America has trained them that it's really the trial lawyers that are evil, picking on poor old corporate America. They believe that the equality for all is just too idealistic, that there is no such thing. And a lot of the opinions of the United States Supreme Court have led to that. There's not equality for all. They see a lot of bad results in the criminal courts, making people understand that there's not equality for all. They are also very conservative. They have one of the things that they did have during their generation was the AIDS crisis. AIDS crisis tended to create a very conservative and cautious mentality among Gen Xers. They're very value-oriented in products. So we have to keep that in mind. They go to a lot of trouble to figure out what's the true value of something that they're buying, as opposed to it goes right along with rejecting hyperbole and flash. They try to work their way, since they're conservative, they try to work their way through the flash and get down to the actual value. Okay, this carries right over to our evidence. They try to work through the flash, they try to work through the hyperbole and arrive at a real value. And so when we're proving up a case to Generation X jurors, we have to prove the numbers that we give them. You can't just stand up and say that a reasonable award for physical pain and mental anguish in this case is $500,000. They want to know why it's $500,000. They want to know, how did you arrive at that? Why is it $500,000 instead of $400,000? Why is it $500,000 instead of $438,000? Where do you get that number? You can't just, they're very value oriented, so you have to be able to show them how you arrive at the figures you've arrived at. It's extremely important. They're very cautious with money. So they may very well be cautious with the defendant's money. They'll be more cautious with the defendant's money than the boomers were. So show them why. Give them a good reason why this case is worth this amount of money. They learn best, like every generation, they learn best through imagery. They were the ones that they're not seduced by flashy advertising, but they reject flashiness. But there's a difference in imagery between just being flashy and presenting persuasive, interactive imagery that they can relate to, imagery that tells a story or adds to the story that we're telling. And I'll talk to you about that when we talk about demonstrative evidence. Cynicism. You got to love this one. They believe more in UFOs than in their receipt of Social Security. So this is a lot of the members of this generation are members of the right wing, the far right wing, and members of the Republican Party base. I was amazed by this statistic, though, that only 25% regard themselves as religious. Now, when you look at that on the surface, that only 25% regard themselves as religious, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But a lot of people, they rejected a lot of the flashiness and a lot of the overstatement. And this is the generation that, to a large extent, came up with the TV evangelist. And there were all kind of scandals with TV evangelists. And I think they were flashy, and they dealt in hyperbole. And I think a lot of that had to do with the rejection of religion. It's not to say that they're not religious, because they are. But I think what they're rejecting is organized religion. They're rejecting the church, as opposed to, that is not to say that they don't have a belief in a supreme being, but it is to say that they reject the organized church and a lot of hyperbole that comes out of the organized church. These folks were visually educated. They were the first generation that were computer literate. In fact, they're the generation that created a lot of the computer science that provided all this for the rest of us. They're more moved by images than words. Let me say that again. They are more moved by images than words. So nonverbal communication, 55% of the persuasive process. So words, 8% of the persuasive process. That applies to everybody. They're more moved by images than words. These people were visually educated. They learn best through the use of multimedia. And so we always try to make a very strong multimedia presentation to the jury without getting into flashiness, without getting into hyperbole. Make an honest presentation in the fashion of multimedia. Give them a lot of things to look at so that they can interact. They multitask, not like Gen Y, not like the Millennials, but this group multitask. One of the reasons they multitask is because television was their life. They had so much. Television was really in its heyday, and people started, instead of having dinner at the dining room table, they would sit in the living room and watch television, but they'd be doing something else while they're watching television. So they learned to multitask. The spoken words to them are boring. Now this is important too, and it applies to both Gen X and Gen Y. They have high regard for long-established tradition. So if you have a malpractice case, for example, the long-established tradition is the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And I've started many a cross-examination with now doctor, can we agree that you were taught in medical school that first do no harm? The Hippocratic Oath is the creed of your profession, yes. Now let's talk about the harm that you did in this case, and then move on to there. So they relate to cases where you can show that the Hippocratic Oath was broken, or that any other rule or any other long-standing tradition was broken. Long-standing traditions is a hallmark of the conservative mentality, so this is not anything unexpected, but it's something we have to keep in mind when dealing with them. They're persuaded by themes that deal with ethics, rules, morality, and so when you're talking about traditions, when you're talking about rules, you're talking about the rules of the road, which is such a popular term today. In medical malpractice, you want to prove the protocols. What are the protocols that control that they're within the profession, established by the profession for the safety of the patient? What specific protocol, medical protocol, was broken here? What specific medical rule of safety for the patient was broken here by this medical care provider that injured this patient? If you're talking about safety rules at a job site or safety rules in design of a product, things of that nature, those rules are critical. And this generation and especially the millennials resonate to those rules. So you don't just talk about those rules. You show those rules. You put those rules up. You explain the rule. You have an expert explain the rule, or you have anyone explain the rule who's qualified. You explain the rule. You explain the reason. Let them look at it. Show and tell. Let them look at the rule. Then explain the reason for the rule. What is its purpose? What was it designed to prevent? Who was it designed to protect? And then talk about how the defendant broke the rule, and by breaking the rule, who did it injure, and how did the injury occur? And so you carry that all the way through. You make a big deal out of rules because these people were born and raised with rules. So rules of the road are important. They relate to themes that appeal to pragmatism. They believe in that you hope for the best and plan for the worst. This can backfire on an anti-plaintiff, in an anti-plaintiff hindsight bias if you don't do it right, because the hindsight bias is they will look back when they're reviewing things in the jury room, if they're not guided otherwise, they will look back to the last thing that occurred. And they'll say, well, they should have, and the last thing that occurred was usually an action by the plaintiff before they were injured, their reaction or whatever. But they'll look back and they'll say, well, the plaintiff should have seen this. That is, the plaintiff should have planned for the worst. So what happened here to the plaintiff could have been prevented by the plaintiff if the plaintiff had planned for the worst, if they had foreseen this. And then they use defensive attribution that says, I know I would have foreseen it. I know I would have done this. I would have done that. I would have done something to prevent this. So, but that's their pragmatic approach. Since they are so very self-reliant, they resonate to themes where someone has lost their self-reliance. If you have a plaintiff who has lost his or her ability to rely upon themselves and do for themselves and care for themselves and feed themselves and work for themselves and do all the things for themselves that we do as part of self-reliance, this is your generation. Because when you talk about a plaintiff, you talk in terms of three things, three different views of the plaintiff. Because you always want to think, when you're proving damage, you always want to remember three words. Compared to what? The plaintiff's condition, what is the plaintiff's condition today? Well, it's one thing to prove the plaintiff's condition today, but compared to what? So the first thing you prove is the plaintiff's condition before this tragedy. And you go into great detail proving how self-reliant they were, all the things they could do before, and all the things they did for themselves before. Then you talk about their status today, and all those things that they were self-reliant and could do for themselves that they can no longer do for themselves, that they have to rely upon someone else to do for them. The more serious the injury, the more this just becomes just absolutely devastating proof against the defendant. So then you talk about life care plan and what's going to be the future and their lack of self-reliance in the future. This is not just important, this is a defining Gen X characteristic, because they were the first truly self-reliant generation. They resonate to themes that deal with loss of independence. And because they're so independent themselves, they were forced to be independent. Both parents out of the home, they came home in the afternoon from school and they were there alone, and they had to be independent. And again, this is a Gen X characteristic. So you want to prove loss of independence. Again, it goes back to self-reliance. What are all those things that they can't do now independently that they could do before? But you talk about it in terms of their loss of independence. You talk about if the close relationship between parents and children. They value this, and in the right case where there's damage to the parent-child relationship in any fashion, then this is the generation. They're very strong about it because they place the family and the quality of life ahead of a career. More than any other generation, these Xers, you cannot put a plaintiff on the stand to whine about their injuries. You cannot put a plaintiff on the stand to whine about their injuries. We try to put the plaintiff on the stand and ask them a very few questions. We try to prove up the injuries through other people. We don't want to put the plaintiff on and have them just testify to all the things they can't do. We have other people testify to all the things that this person used to do in self-reliance that they can no longer do. We have them talk about what the plaintiff testifies to is that they're doing the best they can with what they have left, that they have a plan for rehabilitation, that they are that they're on a program of rehabilitation, that they're doing therapy, they're doing whatever it is they're doing, because you want to put the plaintiff on the stand just long enough to project one thing, and all you need is courage. That should be the overriding theme, I believe. I believe a jury resonates to courage in an injured party more than any other single element. That this is a person who's doing the best they can with what they have left, because they will then want to help those who help themselves. So if you put the plaintiff on to prove that they're doing everything they can for themselves, then you got a much better chance that the jury will be willing to help them. But do not put the plaintiff on and have them whine about their own injuries. Xers don't respond to overstatement. They don't respond to hyperbole or dramatic presentation. It's important to support all claims of your injured party substantively. This is what's known as conscious mind evidence. Substantively, in other words, when you prove physical pain and mental anguish, you can talk about physical pain and mental anguish, but you need to offer evidence of physical pain and mental anguish, more than just a plaintiff saying, well, it hurts here. You need to have the medical records that show that it was notated daily by the nurses of the level of pain. You may have the nurses testify the pain that the plaintiff endured. You have the therapist. Therapists are great witnesses as to the pain, the frustration, and the disability that that this plaintiff has, and that's substantive proof. When these people come in who are in the process of trying to heal someone, and they bring in their records and show what was done and what was required and all the things that are going to be needed in the future, that's substantive evidence, and that resonates in the conscious mind. All right, so that's basically Gen X in a nutshell.